In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets are meant to stay politely hidden beneath teacups and trimmed hedges, a single doubtful assertion shatters the calm. When a villager claims to have witnessed something impossible, something that threatens reputations and long-buried truths, Miss Marple senses danger wrapped in gentility. As gossip turns to suspicion and small lies grow into glaring contradictions, she must untangle motives, alibis, and whispered grudges. What really happened that night? Who is hiding behind a carefully crafted story, and why does one harmless statement feel disturbingly wrong? Chapter 1. A Curious Claim at the Bluebell Tea Room. Morning sunlight filtered gently through the lace curtains of the Bluebell Tea Room, scattering a soft, honey-gold warmth across the room. The tiny establishment, nestled at the corner of St. Mary Mead's High Street, smelled of freshly baked scones, lemon curd, and that comforting blend of Assam and Earl Grey that Mrs. Beeton, the proprietor, swore was her secret to good business. Villagers drifted in and out with the slow, unhurried rhythm characteristic of St. Mary Mead, an English village that prided itself on its civility, its rose gardens, and above all, its gossip. Miss Jane Marple entered with her usual quiet grace. She was dressed in a pale blue cardigan, a neatly pinned brooch shaped like a violet flower, and a straw hat trimmed with a soft ribbon. She greeted Mrs. Beeton with a warm nod before choosing her preferred seat near the window, an unobstructed vantage point that allowed an excellent view of both the tea room and the high street outside. She settled her knitting basket beside her and took out the beginnings of a mauve scarf. Her needles clicked rhythmically, but her pale blue eyes, bright with perpetual curiosity, took in everything from the new arrangement of roses on the counter to the slight scuff on Mr. Pritchard's shoes as he hesitated near the door. To Miss Marple, details were never simply details. They were threads waiting patiently to be woven into understanding. The bell above the tea-room door chimed again, admitting a gust of fresh air and Mr. Lionel Newcomb, St. Mary Mead's newly arrived resident. His presence had become something of a fascination, particularly among the village's more talkative inhabitants. He was a man of 40-something, tall, with a neatly trimmed mustache and a polished London manner that contrasted starkly with the village's rustic rhythms. He always appeared slightly hurried, as though perpetually 5 minutes late to something important. Yet, for reasons no one could quite pinpoint, he had taken an unexpected liking to St. Mary Mead. He ordered tea, Darjeeling, not the local blend, and seated himself 2 tables from Miss Marple, his newspaper tucked under his arm. Despite the casual air he tried to project, there was something restless about him today. His foot tapped the tiled floor with quick, impatient beats. Moments later, Mrs. Amelia Price, a cheerful woman in her late 50s with a propensity for enthusiastic storytelling, swept into the tea room. She spotted Miss Marple immediately and hurried over with that unmistakable eagerness worn only by someone carrying a piece of fresh, delicious news. "Miss Marple, my dear, you won't believe the most extraordinary thing I've heard this morning," she declared, barely giving Miss Marple time to set down her knitting. Miss Marple offered her a mild smile. "Do sit down, Amelia. You look quite flushed with excitement. Another of your spirited tidings?" "No, no, this one is absolutely astonishing and quite alarming, too." She sank into the chair opposite Miss Marple, smoothing her skirt. "You know how Mrs. Larchmont's maid sometimes walks the old footpath behind the vicarage to collect herbs? Well," she leaned forward dramatically, "she claims to have seen Mr. Newcomb at the vicarage back door last night at 10:30. Miss Marple blinked in gentle surprise. "Mr. Newcomb? At 10:30?" Mr. Newcomb stiffened slightly in his seat, though he pretended to be absorbed in the newspaper. "Yes," Mrs. Price whispered conspiratorially. "And that's not all. The maid said he was arguing with someone inside, raised voices. She didn't hear the words, of course, but she was sure of the tone. Quite heated. Very improper for that hour, don't you think? Miss Marple tapped a knitting needle lightly against her yarn. Her brows drew together in polite contemplation. But the vicarage at 10:30? That seems very unlike Mr. Newcomb, and certainly unlike the vicar. Exactly. So you see why this is quite the talk. And the maid swears by it. You know how servants tend to notice things that others don't. At this moment, Mr. Newcomb abruptly folded his newspaper with an exaggerated display of irritation. "If I may interrupt," he said sharply, standing up, his voice trembling with indignation. "I must correct this ludicrous rumor before it gathers wings. I was not at the vicarage last night. At 10:30 I was at home, reading." Mrs. Price gasped. "But the maid said—" "I don't care what she claims. She must have mistaken someone else." "And the raised voices?" Miss Marple asked in a voice as gentle as a drifting cloud. "I know nothing of raised voices," he said curtly, reaching for his coat. "This entire conversation is absurd. Whoever is spreading this nonsense ought to mind their own affairs." He strode out of the tea room, the bell jingling violently as the door slammed behind him. The tea room fell into a thick hush. Mrs. Price stared wide-eyed. Mrs. Beeton clutched her teapot mid-pour. Even Mr. Pritchard looked up from his chessboard in the corner. Miss Marple, however, resumed her knitting with calm deliberation. "Well," Mrs. Price murmured after a long moment, "if he's innocent, he's certainly awfully defensive." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "Oh, I wouldn't say that, Amelia. People often react strongly to accusations they perceive as unfair. But what interests me is something quite different." "What's that, Jane?" Miss Marple leaned back lightly in her chair. "Mrs. Larchmont's maid walks the footpath behind the vicarage every evening, does she not?" "Yes, she gathers herbs and tidies the path when she can." "And she knows the residents well enough to distinguish them in the dusk?" "Oh, I should think so. She's lived here all her life." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Then her assertion is curious. Doubtful, perhaps. Not impossible, but not entirely convincing. And yet Mr. Newcomb's reaction suggests something more than simple annoyance." Her eyes flicked subtly toward the tea-room door. "It is a little odd," Mrs. Price agreed. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "I wonder, Amelia, what could prompt someone to claim such a sighting? And why? After all, the maid had nothing to gain by making such a statement." "That's just the thing," Mrs. Price said, lowering her voice again. "The maid wasn't gossiping. She mentioned it privately to Mrs. Larchmont, who then mentioned it to Dr. Leonard because she was worried something improper was happening. Dr. Leonard told his wife, who told Mrs. Spencer, and then— well." Mrs. Price gestured helplessly. "You know how it goes." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "I do." Outside the window, the high street bustled on. Children ran past with satchels, Mr. Tompkins swept the street outside his bakery, and Mrs. Beeton's cat strolled leisurely along the curb. Yet beneath the calm surface of village life, a small ripple had begun, a tiny disturbance, and Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to know that innocuous claims rarely remained innocuous, felt the faint tingle of a mystery forming. A few minutes later, the vicar himself entered the tea-room, smiling warmly as always. He greeted Miss Marple and Mrs. Price as he passed their table. Miss Marple watched him discreetly. He carried no sign of agitation or discomfort, nothing to suggest that a late-night argument had occurred in his home. "Good morning, Miss Marple, Mrs. Price," he said kindly. "I trust you are both well?" "Very well, thank you," Miss Marple replied. "And yourself?" "Quite splendid. I was just on my way to the church hall. Preparations for the charity sale, you know. Always something to organize." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. And everything was quiet at the vicarage last night, I trust. The vicar blinked, puzzled. Quiet? Oh, yes, certainly. Mrs. Weatherby came by earlier in the evening to drop off some linens, but she left well before 9. After that, I spent my time preparing Sunday's message. A peaceful evening indeed. Mrs. Price shot Miss Marple a pointed look the moment the vicar walked away. You see, he says it was quiet. No arguing, no visitors, nothing at all. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, quite. And that means the maid must be wrong. Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, but not necessarily. People very often report what they believe they saw. Mrs. Price frowned. But you said her statement was doubtful. Doubtful does not mean false, Amelia, only inconsistent. And inconsistencies are always worth a closer look. She paused, her gaze drifting back to the window. Mr. Newcomb was outside, striding briskly across the street, his expression still tight with annoyance. His pace was quick, too quick, Miss Marple thought, for a man who claimed to have no secrets to hide. There is something peculiar about Mr. Newcomb, she murmured. Mrs. Price leaned in eagerly. You've noticed it too. He always seems on edge, and he hardly socializes with anyone except Dr. Leonard, and even that only occasionally. Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. Everyone has their reasons for behaving as they do. I try not to suspect people simply because they seem nervous. But your instincts, you're never wrong, Jane. Oh no, Amelia, Miss Marple protested. I am wrong frequently, but I pay attention, and paying attention often leads one toward the truth. She resumed her knitting, though her needlework had slowed. Her mind was piecing together the fragile beginnings of a puzzle, one consisting of a maid's claim, a defensive denial, a calm vicar, and the faintest scent of something amiss. A mystery rarely announces itself outright. It begins with something small, an odd remark, a forgotten glove, a curious statement. And often, as Miss Marple had learned through a lifetime of quiet observation, the grandest revelations sprout from the tiniest seeds. In the hours that followed, Miss Marple found her thoughts returning again and again to the maid's so-called sighting. Why had she spoken of it? Why had Mr. Newcomb denied it so sharply? Why had the vicar known nothing of it? And perhaps most importantly, if the assertion was indeed doubtful, what truth lay beneath it? She finished her tea, folded her knitting neatly into her basket, and rose from her chair. Mrs. Price walked with her to the door. What do you think will happen next, Jane? She asked. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a mix of curiosity and mild concern. Well, Amelia, I believe that we shall soon find out whether this curious claim is merely a misunderstanding, or the beginning of something rather more serious. For in St. Mary Mead nothing stayed hidden for long, and a doubtful assertion once made had a way of unraveling far more than anyone expected. Chapter 2. The stir in St. Mary Mead. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, the sort of English morning that compelled nearly everyone in St. Mary Mead to step outside, inhale the cool air, and make a remark about how spring seems rather early this year. Yet beneath that gentle sunlit calm, an unmistakable murmur of conversation hummed through the village. The previous day's curious assertion, the maid's claim of having seen Mr. Lionel Newcomb at the vicarage late at night, had circulated with surprising speed, touching nearly every corner of the community. Miss Marple did not venture into gossip, but she knew human nature well enough to expect the ripples. People in small villages noticed things, collected them, examined them, and often embellished them without malice. It was simply the way life flowed in a place where everyone knew, or believed they knew, everyone else. By mid-morning, Miss Marple decided to walk to the greengrocer for a fresh head of cabbage and some apples. The spring air was invigorating, and she welcomed the opportunity to stretch her legs. As she stepped out of her charming vine-clad cottage, her garden of daisies and pinks nodding gently in the breeze, she paused to take in the serene view of the village. Nothing looked amiss. Birds chirped, Mrs. Phillips next door hung her washing, and the milkman trundled down the lane. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that villages could look peaceful even when their social undercurrents were anything but. At the greengrocer's, she found a modest queue and an exceptionally animated shopkeeper, Mr. Wilfred Croston, who appeared to be in the middle of recounting something for the third or fourth time. "Well now," he said, polishing an apple with unnecessary vigor, "if you ask me, that Mr. Newcomb fellow has always been peculiar. Yes, indeed, something shifty in the eyes and walking about at such hours of the night. Not natural," Mrs. Hargreaves tutted disapprovingly. "But he said he wasn't there." "Of course he said so," Mr. Croston replied knowingly. "You don't expect a guilty man to admit anything, do you?" Miss Marple stepped lightly into the conversation with her quiet politeness. "Good morning, Mr. Croston. Mrs. Hargreaves." Both turned and greeted her warmly. "Ah, Miss Marple, you're out early today," Mr. Croston said, reaching for the scale. "What shall it be this morning?" "A cabbage and 6 of your best apples, if you please," she replied. "As you wish." He busied himself with the items, though Miss Marple sensed he was eager to continue the conversation. Indeed, when he looked up again, his eyes gleamed. "And what do you make of the matter at the vicarage, Miss Marple? Surely you've heard by now." Miss Marple took her time arranging her shopping basket. "I have heard something about it, yes." "Well, seems a strange business, doesn't it? A man lurking about that late?" "Quite strange," Miss Marple said calmly, "if it happened." Mrs. Hargreaves gasped softly. "Are you saying the maid is lying, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not lying, perhaps, but people do sometimes misinterpret things, especially in poor light. And especially when they expect to see someone." Mr. Croston blinked. "Expect to see someone?" "Yes. If you walk the same path every evening, you get used to shapes and silhouettes. It's quite easy to mistake a tall man for another tall man, especially if you see only the outline." "You mean she could have seen someone else entirely?" Mrs. Hargreaves asked. "It's possible," Miss Marple said, "though it is equally possible that Mr. Newcomb was there after all. We mustn't jump to conclusions either way." Mr. Croston looked mildly disappointed, perhaps hoping for a firmer opinion. But Miss Marple merely smiled, paid for her groceries, and left them to their speculations. As she made her way back toward the high street, she reflected on how quickly a curious claim could transform into village certainty. A whisper became a report developed into a theory, and soon enough people behaved as though they had witnessed the event themselves. Yet the truth, Miss Marple knew, was often far more subtle. Her next stop was the post office, where she found a small cluster of familiar faces. Mrs. Florence Spencer, tall and brisk, stood at the counter discussing stamps with the postmistress. Mr. Leonard Jones, a retired schoolmaster with an impressive white mustache, was sorting through his letters with the deliberation of a man checking exam results. And beside the window loitered Mrs. Weatherby, whose sweet grandmotherly appearance concealed a sharp and curious mind. "Jane, my dear," Mrs. Spencer called as soon as Miss Marple entered. "Just the person I wanted to see. I hear you had a close encounter with the center of yesterday's excitement." Miss Marple suppressed a smile. "I wouldn't say close encounter. I was simply having tea when Mr. Newcomb denied the maid's account." Mrs. Spencer's eyes widened dramatically. "Denied it? Quite firmly, I hear." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Quite firmly indeed." "Well," Mrs. Spencer clucked her tongue disapprovingly, A man who denies something so quickly must have something to hide. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. Or he might simply be annoyed by gossip. Mrs. Weatherby leaned in. But what if the maid's story is true? What business would Mr. Newcomb have at the vicarage at such an hour? I saw him just the other day carrying a parcel that looked suspiciously like a stack of documents. Documents, dear Jane. Why would a gentleman newly arrived in the village need to carry around so much paperwork? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Mrs. Weatherby, she knew, possessed an uncanny ability to draw elaborate conclusions from the flimsiest threads. There are many reasons a person might carry documents, Miss Marple said kindly. Bills, letters, personal notes. Ah, but you didn't see the parcel, Mrs. Weatherby insisted. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, the sort of parcel that usually contains something important. From the corner of her eye, Miss Marple noticed Mr. Leonard Jones frown thoughtfully at this description. Miss Marple thanked the postmistress and stepped outside, accompanied by Mrs. Weatherby and Mrs. Spencer. The village green stretched before them, its well-kept hedges and wooden benches basking in the warm light. It was a peaceful scene that belied the undercurrent of curiosity flowing through St. Mary Mead that day. I must say, Mrs. Spencer continued, I find it all terribly unsettling. A man we hardly know arriving with a mysterious background, then found, according to the maid, disturbing the peace at the vicarage. It doesn't reflect well on the village. Miss Marple gave a sympathetic nod. It certainly raises questions, but it is wise to remember that uncertainty often breeds imagination. Mrs. Spencer sniffed. Perhaps, but I still think there is more to Mr. Newcomb than meets the eye. With polite farewells, the two women departed, leaving Miss Marple to continue her walk alone. She decided to take the long route home, passing by the churchyard. The gravestones stood in neat rows, their inscriptions softened by time. Beyond them, the vicarage appeared serene, its ivy-draped walls glowing softly in the sunlight. No sign of unrest, no hint of midnight arguments. As Miss Marple paused to admire a patch of bluebells near the path, she heard the crunch of gravel behind her. Turning gently, she saw Dr. Leonard Huxley approaching. He was a genial, steady man in his early 50s, always impeccably dressed and unfailingly polite. His wife, Margaret, was known for her fondness for social activities and her tendency to spread harmless chatter. Good morning, Miss Marple. Dr. Huxley greeted her with a warm smile. Out enjoying the morning air? Indeed I am, Doctor, she replied. It's too fine a day to remain indoors. Dr. Huxley paused beside her, looking thoughtfully at the vicarage. I hear quite a fuss has begun over something the maid claimed to have seen. Miss Marple nodded. She believes she saw Mr. Newcomb at the vicarage late at night. Yes, Dr. Huxley said with a sigh. Margaret mentioned it over dinner. Honestly, Jane, this village is far too eager to think the worst of newcomers. Miss Marple observed him closely. His tone, though mildly exasperated, held a trace of something else. Concern? Caution? You don't believe the maid's statement, then? She asked gently. Dr. Huxley hesitated. I didn't say that. I simply think people should be careful before assuming guilt. After all, it might have been an honest mistake. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Or it might not. He met her gaze, and after a moment he nodded. Or it might not. He cleared his throat. Truth be told, I've had the sense that Mr. Newcomb is burdened by something. Last week, during his annual checkup, he seemed tense. More tense than I would expect from a man in good health. Miss Marple tilted her head. Health is not always the cause of tension. Precisely, Dr. Huxley said. It could be anything. Personal troubles, financial strain, or perhaps, he paused, something he doesn't want the village to know. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. That is certainly possible. Dr. Huxley glanced at the vicarage once more. Well, I must be on my way. Mrs. Grover twisted her ankle again, and I promised to check on her. He gave Miss Marple a courteous nod and left down the path. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her thoughts weaving themselves into patterns. She had spoken with 3 of the villagers that morning, Mrs. Spencer, Mrs. Weatherby, and Dr. Huxley, and each had given her a distinct impression of Mr. Newcomb. One considered him suspicious, another considered him mysterious, and the third thought him troubled. Yet all their impressions pointed in the same direction. Something about Lionel Newcomb simply did not fit comfortably within the genteel fabric of St. Mary Mead. As she continued her walk home, she noticed someone else approaching from the opposite direction. A woman in a crisp gray skirt and white blouse carrying a basket of fresh herbs. Martha Larchmont, the maid in question. Miss Marple greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Martha." "Oh, Miss Marple." Martha's eyes widened slightly. She had the look of someone startled out of thought. "Good morning." "You seem a bit preoccupied," Miss Marple observed. Martha bit her lip. "It's been a strange morning, miss. Ever since I mentioned seeing Mr. Newcomb last night, people keep asking me questions. It's all gotten rather out of hand. I imagine it must be overwhelming." Miss Marple's voice was sympathetic, calm. "If I may ask, were you quite sure it was Mr. Newcomb you saw?" Martha frowned. "Yes, I thought I was sure. He looked like him. Tallish, dark coat, walking quickly." He paused at the vicarage back door. "I couldn't hear much, but there were raised voices. One sounded like a man. The other could have been the vicar or someone else, but—" She hesitated. "It was dark, and I only saw him for a few seconds." Miss Marple noticed the uncertainty creeping in. "It is difficult," she said gently, "to be completely certain about someone in poor light." Martha nodded. "I know, but I truly believed it was him, and now everyone keeps saying I'm mistaken or stirring trouble. I didn't mean to cause a fuss." "You likely did what you thought was right," Miss Marple assured her. "Sometimes even honest observations can lead to confusion." Martha exhaled in relief. "Thank you, miss. You're always so understanding." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Take care on your walk, Martha." As the maid departed, Miss Marple observed her with quiet thoughtfulness. Martha's sincerity seemed genuine, but sincerity did not guarantee accuracy. And yet, neither did Mr. Newcomb's indignation guarantee innocence. As Miss Marple resumed her path, she encountered one last villager before reaching home, Mr. Harold Fletcher, a middle-aged man known for his keen ears and deep interest in local affairs. He stopped her with a respectful nod. "Morning, Miss Marple. Quite the stir, isn't it?" "So it seems," she said. "Well," Mr. Fletcher continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "between you and me, I saw Mr. Newcomb returning to his house at about 11:15 last night. Looked rather flustered." Miss Marple's brows rose. "Indeed." "Oh yes, I was on my way home from the pub, and I remember thinking it odd because he usually stays home in the evenings." "Did he say anything to you?" No. He didn't even see me. Walked past in a hurry, almost brushed right by me." Miss Marple thanked him and continued home, her mind buzzing quietly with new information. Mr. Fletcher's sighting slightly overlapped with the maid's claimed sighting. That was interesting. Very interesting. If Mr. Newcomb had indeed been out that late, then he had lied to the entire tea room. And if he lied, why lie? Back at her cozy cottage, Miss Marple placed her basket on the kitchen table. The sun cast warm, gentle rays through the window. The familiar ticking clock and the scent of lavender made her home feel safe and serene. Yet Miss Marple's intuition hummed, a sensation she had come to recognize as the early stirrings of a deeper mystery. Something was amiss in St. Mary Mead. A doubtful assertion had been made. A man had denied it too quickly. A maid wavered between certainty and doubt, and another witness had stepped forward with a conflicting piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple, her mind quietly as sharp as ever, knew this was no mere misunderstanding. It was the beginning of what precisely she could not yet say. But she intended to find out. Chapter 3, Conversations Over Garden Gates. The morning sun filtered through the dusty curtains of the old railway rest house as Detective Adrian Cross awoke with the same heaviness that had lingered in his chest since the discovery of the body. His mind replayed every second of the previous night like a broken film reel. The panicked screams, the eerie silence afterward, and the victim's lifeless face frozen in terror. Despite being known for his unwavering composure, Adrian felt something different this time, something unsettling, as if this case was about to pull him into a darker world than he had ever stepped into before. He stood up, splashed cold water on his face, and stared into the cracked mirror. "Stay sharp," he muttered to himself before heading out. The railway station was quieter now, almost deceptively peaceful. Passengers moved cautiously, whispering about the murder. Adrian walked straight to the cordoned area where Officer Kieran was waiting with new information gathered overnight. "Sir, we questioned around 20 passengers who were closest to the victim before the lights went out," Kieran said, flipping through his notepad. 3 of them mentioned hearing a strange metallic sound, like something scraping against the floor. Adrian frowned, recalling the unusual mark he noticed near the victim's shoes. "Show me everyone who heard that sound," he said. The officer quickly led him to a small waiting room where 3 passengers sat nervously. An old man clutching his walking stick, a middle-aged woman with trembling hands, and a teenage boy who avoided eye contact. Adrian approached the old man first. "Tell me exactly what you heard." The man cleared his throat. It was faint but sharp, like someone dragging a metal rod or a thin object. The middle-aged woman nodded in agreement, adding, "And it wasn't accidental, it felt deliberate, repetitive, like someone doing it intentionally to create fear." The boy hesitated before speaking, his voice barely audible. "I didn't want to say this last night, but I saw a shadow moving near the bench where the man died. Not a person. More like a silhouette creeping along the floor." Adrian leaned forward. "Creeping?" The boy nodded, like whoever it was didn't want to be seen. Adrian didn't dismiss it. Sometimes the smallest, strangest details led to the truth. After interviewing them, Adrian went back to the crime scene, replaying the testimonies in his head. He crouched near the blood-stained bench again, studying the floor with renewed focus. And there it was, a faint metallic scratch mark that extended farther than he originally noticed, crossing the tiles like a path. It led toward the maintenance door at the far end of the platform. "Why here?" he whispered. He slowly pushed the door open. Inside was darkness, thick and suffocating, smelling of rusted tools and damp concrete. Adrian switched on his flashlight and scanned the room. Nothing seemed disturbed at first, but then he noticed a small, shiny fragment wedged between 2 old wooden crates. He picked it up carefully. It was a piece of metal, thin, sharp, possibly broken off from a larger object. "Weapon fragment," Adrian muttered. But something about it felt strange. It was too polished, too deliberately shaped. As he continued searching, he found something else lying near the wall. A torn piece of fabric, dark blue with a thin red stripe. It looked like it belonged to a uniform. Adrian's heart quickened. A worker, he wondered, or someone disguising themselves as one. The possibility opened up new directions in the investigation. He placed the evidence into a small pouch and exited the room just as Officer Kieran approached. Sir, there's something else, Kieran said, panting slightly. The victim's phone has been unlocked by the tech team. Adrian raised an eyebrow. Good. Anything interesting? Kieran nodded. Very. The victim had received a message just minutes before he died. It said, "Meet me at platform 4, come alone. I have something you must see." Adrian froze. Who sent it? Kieran flipped another page. Unknown number. Registered under a fake identity. Adrian felt the threads tightening. Someone had lured the victim here intentionally. This wasn't random. This was orchestrated. Where's the phone now? Adrian asked. At the surveillance desk, Kieran replied. They walked quickly through the corridor to the monitoring room, where screens displayed various angles of the station. The tech officer handed the phone to Adrian and pointed to a screen showing last night's footage. Watch this, she said. On the screen, the victim arrived at platform 4, looking around cautiously. A few seconds later, a figure in a blue uniform with a red stripe appeared in the background, face hidden, movement smooth, almost calculated. The figure didn't approach the victim directly, but stayed in the shadows, observing. Adrian's pulse quickened. There, he said, pointing. Pause. Zoom in. The tech officer zoomed in as much as the grainy footage allowed. The figure's hand was visible, and in it, a long metallic object that glinted under the dim station light. The murder weapon, Adrian whispered. Suddenly he noticed something else. On the wall behind the mysterious figure, someone had scribbled a symbol, something circular with intersecting lines like a distorted compass. Has this always been there? Adrian asked. The officer shook her head. No, sir. Our team cleans graffiti every 2 days. This wasn't here before. Adrian stared at the symbol. His gut tightened. He had seen something like it once, years ago, in a case involving a secretive group known for manipulative games and psychological traps. But that group had vanished. At least that's what everyone believed. Before he could dwell on it further, another officer entered. Sir, we got the autopsy report. Adrian opened it and scanned quickly. The cause of death wasn't what they expected. The victim wasn't killed only by the stab wound. There were traces of a rare toxin in his bloodstream, something that paralyzed the body before death. So the killer didn't take any chances, Adrian murmured. They wanted to make sure he couldn't scream, couldn't fight, couldn't run. This level of planning wasn't normal. This was precise, practiced, almost ritualistic. As the day moved into afternoon, Adrian stepped outside the station to clear his mind. The breeze brushed past him, but the weight in his chest didn't lighten. Every new clue deepened the shadows of the case instead of clearing them. He took a slow breath, scanning the bustling crowds. Somewhere among these people, the killer might be moving freely. Someone who understood the station well enough to navigate its blind spots. Someone confident enough to leave symbols behind. Someone who knew how to disappear. Adrian's phone vibrated suddenly. A new message, no name, no number. Just a single line that sent a chill to his bones. You're looking in the wrong place, detective. Adrian stared at the message, feeling the world around him shift. The killer wasn't just ahead of him, they were watching him, and they wanted him to know. Chapter 4. A discrepancy in the afternoon post. The message on Adrian's phone lingered in his mind like a whisper trapped between walls. You're looking in the wrong place, detective. He stared at the screen for a long moment, his expression unreadable, though his pulse quickened. It wasn't just a threat, it was a taunt, a challenge, and most dangerously, a sign that the killer was close enough to watch him without being noticed. That level of boldness wasn't common among criminals. It belonged to someone who believed they were untouchable, someone who thrived in the shadows. Adrian put his phone away and walked back toward the station, but every step felt heavier, as though he was walking deeper into a labyrinth designed by someone who knew exactly how to manipulate fear. Inside the station, passengers continued moving in nervous clusters, whispering behind cupped hands, avoiding the corner where the body had been found. Adrian noticed how easily panic spread among them, how suspicion flickered in every pair of eyes. It reminded him of an old saying his mentor once told him. A murder doesn't just kill a person. It kills the peace of everyone who saw the aftermath. He understood that now. He approached Officer Kieran, who was reviewing surveillance footage again. "Sir, any updates?" Kieran asked. Adrian shook his head. "Nothing yet. But the killer is watching us." Kieran's eyes widened. Adrian didn't elaborate. Instead, he redirected their focus. "We need to revisit everything we collected. The uniform, the metal fragment, the symbol on the wall. They all mean something, and we're missing the thread connecting them." They walked to the makeshift investigation room the station authorities provided. Papers were spread across a rectangular table: photos, autopsy reports, statements, and sketches of the strange symbol. Adrian sat down and stared at the symbol again. The intersecting lines forming a distorted compass triggered a memory he had been trying to suppress. Years ago, during a case in northern districts, he encountered a similar marking. At that time, it belonged to a group calling themselves the Circle of Echoes, a covert ring responsible for orchestrated psychological games. They rarely committed murders but were known for manipulation, blackmail, and symbolic warnings. Their activities halted abruptly after a major operation dismantled their core members. But Adrian now wondered if someone from that group had resurfaced. Or worse, if the group had never truly dissolved. Before he could delve deeper into that thought, an officer entered hurriedly. "Sir, you need to see this. We found more scratch marks." Adrian and Kieran followed him down to the far end of Platform 4, where the officer pointed to the ground near a drainage grate. The marks were identical to the metallic trail found near the body, but these were longer, deeper, and appeared fresher. "It looks like something or someone dragged a metal tool here recently," the officer explained. Adrian knelt, tracing the marks with his finger. "This direction," he murmured, following the trail with his eyes. It led toward a maintenance storage room that was supposedly locked and unused for years. "Open it," he ordered. The door groaned as it was unlocked, unleashing a stale odor of rust and neglect. Adrian stepped inside slowly, flashlights sweeping across cracked tiles and broken shelves. The beam stopped abruptly when it caught a strange pattern on the floor. A chalk-drawn circle almost identical to the symbol found on the wall, but larger, more detailed. Adrian's stomach tightened. "This wasn't here last night," he said quietly. The edges of the circle were uneven, suggesting it was drawn hastily. Inside it lay a single object, a small silver whistle, old-fashioned, its mouthpiece slightly dented. Kieran frowned. "Why leave a whistle?" Adrian picked it up with gloves. "Because it's a message." He blew lightly into the whistle. No sound came out. It was blocked. He opened it carefully and found a tiny scrap of paper rolled inside. On it, in neat handwriting, were 3 chilling words. "Follow the sound." Adrian felt the hairs on his neck rise. The killer wasn't just mocking him. They were controlling the pace of the investigation, guiding him intentionally. He pocketed the whistle and stood, scanning the room again. Something else caught his attention. A faint ticking sound. Not loud, but persistent, coming from behind an old cabinet. "Move this," he instructed. The officers pushed the cabinet aside, revealing a small device attached to the wall. It wasn't a bomb. It was a timer. But instead of counting down, it had stopped at 02:57. Adrian stared at it. "This was recording something," he said. "Not visual. Audio. The implications hit him like a wave. The killer was here 3 minutes before we entered. The room fell silent. The killer had been inside just moments earlier, watching or listening as the investigation moved closer. Kieran swallowed hard. "Sir, this is dangerous." Adrian nodded. He wasn't reckless, but fear couldn't be allowed to cloud judgment. The killer wanted them nervous, wanted them chasing shadows. Adrian switched off the device and pocketed it. He needed to analyze it later. For now, there was another pressing lead. The message inside the whistle. Follow the sound. What sound? The metallic scraping? The silent whistle? Or something else they had yet to uncover? They left the room and walked back to the platform, each officer scanning their surroundings more cautiously than before. Adrian took a moment to stand still, closing his eyes, trying to listen. The station was alive with noise, voices, train horns, footsteps, announcements. But he focused on something subtle, something almost hidden. Then he heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping like metal hitting metal. It came from beneath the platform. He signaled Kieran silently and moved toward the edge. "Under here," he whispered. "Someone's been down there." They climbed into the narrow space beneath the platform, the air cold and damp. The tapping grew louder. Adrian followed it through the shadows until he reached a small, rusty maintenance cart. On it lay another scrap of fabric matching the blue and red uniform piece, and beside it a long, thin metal rod with scratches along its length, the same pattern found on the tiles. The scraping tool. But the most disturbing object was a small voice recorder placed on the cart, its red light blinking. Adrian picked it up and pressed play. A distorted voice crackled through the speaker. Calm, controlled, almost amused. "Detective Cross, you're getting warmer." The message ended, leaving a suffocating silence in the narrow space. Adrian felt a rush of anger, rare for him. This wasn't just a murder anymore. It was a game, a strategic, psychological hunt where the killer moved pieces long before anyone knew there was a board. As he climbed out from beneath the platform, Adrian realized something with cold clarity. The killer didn't just want to hide. They wanted Adrian to chase them, and they were leading him somewhere far darker than he had anticipated. Chapter 5. The Vicarage Confusion. The morning after the chilling discovery beneath the platform arrived with a heavy gray sky pressing low over the station, as though the world itself sensed the tension brewing beneath its calm exterior. Adrian Cross barely slept. His mind replayed the distorted voice again and again, each syllable dripping with quiet confidence, each pause deliberate, calculated. "You're getting warmer." The words felt less like a taunt now and more like a warning. As he reached the station, an eerie stillness hung over the place. Passengers moved in small pockets, speaking only in hushed voices, their eyes flicking nervously toward shadows as though expecting the killer to materialize from them. Officers paced the platforms with heightened alertness, though Adrian knew vigilance alone wouldn't outsmart someone who had already orchestrated events with such precision. Inside the temporary investigation room, the scattered evidence looked more like fragments of a puzzle intentionally rearranged by unseen hands. Adrian studied the scratching tool retrieved from beneath the platform, long, thin, metallic, and etched with multiple lines. No fingerprints, no obvious origin. But its design resembled something handcrafted rather than mass-produced, the type of object someone with technical knowledge might forge. His eyes drifted to the torn fabric from the blue and red uniform. It wasn't a standard railway uniform. The pattern was different, the stitching finer. It belonged to something ceremonial, possibly old-fashioned. A uniform used for special occasions or by a niche group. It wasn't random. Nothing about this case was random. Kieran entered with 2 steaming cups of tea. "You look like you need this, sir," he said, placing one beside Adrian. Adrian nodded gratefully but didn't touch it. His mind was elsewhere. "Did you check the whistle for fingerprints?" he asked. Kieran shook his head. "None, sir. The whistle is old, decades old, and the paper was cut with precision. Could be someone with access to archival or vintage items." Adrian leaned back. "Everything the killer leaves behind has meaning. The whistle, the timer, the circle, they all point toward a structured mind, someone who sees crime as a performance." Before Kieran could respond, Officer Mira rushed in. "Sir, something's happened in the waiting hall." Adrian stood instantly. The words, "something's happened," always carried weight, but today they felt heavier. As they approached the hall, a crowd had gathered in a semicircle. In the center, a young station cleaner trembled, her face pale. She was pointing to a bench. On it sat a small wooden box, polished old with a symbol carved on top, the same eerie compass-like sign they had found before. Adrian approached slowly. "Everyone back up," he instructed. The officers cleared space and Adrian crouched before the box. He listened first, no ticking, no mechanical hum. He examined it visually. No wires, no trigger mechanisms, just a box. But with this killer, nothing could be taken lightly. He put on gloves and lifted the lid carefully. Inside the box was a single object, a vintage train ticket stamped with a date from 12 years ago, slightly yellowed with age. The destination printed on it, Everthorne Station. Adrian's brow furrowed. Everthorne Station was abandoned years ago after an accident, a fire that spread through the maintenance tunnels and shut the place down permanently. But why would the killer include it? He lifted the ticket and noticed something underneath. A photograph. A faded black and white image of a boy standing at the same station. The boy's face was blurred, intentionally smudged with ink, but the outline of his uniform was clear. The same blue and red pattern. Adrian felt a prickling sensation at the back of his neck. The uniform piece from the crime scene wasn't from this era. It was from the past, a past tied to Everthorne Station. And the boy in the picture had once worn it. Kieran leaned over Adrian's shoulder. "Sir, do you know what this means?" Adrian nodded slowly. "Yes. The killer isn't just playing a game. They're pulling us into history, something unresolved, something buried but not forgotten." His eyes returned to the photograph. "This boy, he's the beginning." Before they could examine further, another officer hurried toward them, breathless. "Sir, we found something else. The symbol freshly drawn near the tracks." Adrian and Kieran rushed outside. On the concrete near the tracks in chalk, the killer had drawn a large arrow pointing toward the tunnel entrance, and beside it the words written boldly, "At noon." "Follow the echoes." Adrian checked his watch. It was 11:15, 45 minutes until noon. The killer was setting a schedule, a structured trail, timed and deliberate. He felt the pressure of the ticking clock even without hearing it. As noon approached, Adrian gathered a small team. The tunnel was dark, expansive, and rarely used except for technical inspections. At exactly 12 a.m, they stepped inside. Every footstep echoed sharply, amplifying the claustrophobic nature of the passage. Adrian moved ahead with his flashlight, sweeping the walls. The chalk marks appeared again, faint but present. Symbols, arrows, scribbles. It was as if the killer had left breadcrumbs while navigating through the darkness. Farther inside, a faint echoing sound reached them, a rhythmic tapping similar to the one heard beneath the platform. "It's coming from up ahead," Adrian said. They followed it until they reached an old rusted maintenance door. Taped to the center was a small audio recorder playing the tapping sound on loop. Another trick, another diversion. Adrian exhaled, both irritated and impressed. The killer anticipated their movements with uncanny accuracy. Behind the door lay an empty maintenance chamber except for a single lantern placed on the floor, illuminating a message written across the wall in bold strokes. You missed the truth once. Will you miss it again? Adrian stared at the words, feeling them cut deeper than any clue before. They weren't just taunting him. They were referencing something personal. Something he had failed at. Something the killer believed he would repeat. Kieran looked troubled. Sir, what truth did you miss? Adrian didn't answer. His mind was already spiraling back 12 years to the fire at Everthorne Station. To the investigation he led back then, to the unanswered questions buried beneath piles of ash, and to the boy whose fate was never fully explained. Suddenly everything connected. The vintage ticket, the uniform, the symbol, the carefully timed clues. This case wasn't just a game, it was a resurrection. A reopening of a wound Adrian didn't know he still carried. The killer wasn't choosing him by chance. They were choosing him because of Everthorne, and because of the truth he failed to uncover. Chapter 6. Secrets Beneath Polite Smiles. The weight of Everthorne Station lingered in Adrian's mind long after they exited the tunnel. The cold, stale air of the underground seemed to cling to him, filling his lungs with memories he had spent over a decade trying to bury. He walked back toward the station in silence, Kieran beside him but wisely not speaking. The message painted on the wall, "You missed the truth once. Will you miss it again?" echoed louder than any words broadcast across the platforms. It was personal, direct, deliberate, and it struck at the very heart of the one case Adrian avoided revisiting. When they reached the investigation room, he finally exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Kieran closed the door behind them, and Adrian leaned on the table, palms flat, staring down at the scattered evidence. 12 years ago, he began slowly. The fire at Everthorne wasn't just an accident. Kieran's eyes snapped to him, but he remained quiet, allowing Adrian to continue. There were inconsistencies, witness statements that didn't align, a missing maintenance worker and a child who disappeared the same night. That boy. He lifted the faded photograph again. He may be connected to everything happening now. Kieran approached cautiously. Sir, were you in charge of that case? Adrian nodded. Yes, it was my first major case. The kind that defines you. Or destroys you. He straightened, pacing slowly. We never found the boy. The fire spread too quickly. By the time we searched the tunnels, everything was gone. His voice hardened. But someone survived. Someone who thinks I ignored something. Someone who believes I left the truth buried in the ashes. He paused, his eyes narrowing. This killer isn't just taunting us. They're reenacting Everthorne. Piece by piece. Before the heaviness of the moment settled completely, Officer Mira knocked briskly and entered. Sir, we received a call. Anonymous, the caller said. Ask the detective why he left the whistle behind. Then they hung up. Adrian's breath tightened. Another reference to the past. Another clue questioning his decisions. He swallowed. In the Everthorne fires, there was a whistle found near the tunnels. It belonged to the missing boy. I sent it for analysis, but the lab lost it in the chaos, or so they claimed. It never resurfaced. He looked at the old whistle left by the killer. Until now. Kieran stepped forward, his voice steady. Sir, this killer knows details only someone involved could know. Adrian nodded. Or someone who lived through it. He lifted the whistle. The boy is either alive, or someone close to him is seeking revenge. As Adrian spoke, the station's announcement system suddenly crackled, an unusual interruption. The speakers buzzed before a distorted voice, clearly manipulated electronically, echoed through every platform. Detective Cross, the past is waiting. Find what you buried. Passengers froze. Officers tensed. Adrian's stomach dropped. The killer had infiltrated the station's announcement system. They were no longer just leaving symbolic clues. They were now controlling the environment itself. Adrian sprang into action. "Trace the source," he ordered. Kieran and Mira rushed out while Adrian moved swiftly through the station. He scanned every speaker, every corner, every hallway. If the killer was bold enough to broadcast a message publicly, they were confident they could disappear just as quickly. As Adrian rounded the corner near Platform 2, he noticed a small device attached to the side of a speaker, a modified transmitter linked to a portable audio player. Clever, simple, effective. He detached it carefully, examining its interior. No fingerprints, no serial numbers, but one detail stood out, a fragment of red thread caught in the corner. Adrian held it between his fingers. It matched the stitching on the torn uniform piece. He moved to the station's security hub where Kieran was already working. "Sir," Kieran said, pointing to a monitor, "we might have something." 10 minutes before the announcement, a figure was seen climbing the service stairs. Adrian leaned in. The footage showed a person in a hooded jacket moving quickly, head down, avoiding cameras with practiced ease. They carried a small bag, likely containing the transmitter and other devices. Adrian watched twice, 3 times, searching for details. The stride was confident, the posture was rigid. But the person moved with the agility of someone familiar with tunnels and maintenance routes. "Freeze there," Adrian said, pointing at a frame where the figure's hand brushed the railing. On their wrist was a bracelet, simple, metallic, slightly worn. Kieran frowned. "Looks handmade." Adrian thought of the symbol-drawn circles, the crafted scratching tool, the old whistle. Everything pointed to someone with a fixation on symbolic objects, possibly ritualistic patterns. Before they could draw deeper conclusions, another officer entered. "Sir, the station manager wants to see you. It's urgent." Adrian and Kieran hurried to the manager's office. Inside, the manager held a sealed envelope, trembling slightly. "This was left on my desk while I stepped out," he said. Adrian took the envelope. No name, no stamp. Just the same haunting symbol drawn on the front. He opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with a handwritten message. "You're still searching in the wrong place." Beneath those words was a drawing, crude but unmistakable. A map of the station tunnels. Adrian spread it on the desk. The map wasn't of the current system. It showed pathways that no longer existed. Old service tunnels closed after the Everthorne fire. Some sections had been sealed, others reroaded. But on this map, one tunnel was circled sharply in red. A tunnel that connected St. Mary Mead Station to Everthorne Station underground. Kieran looked stunned. "Sir, such a tunnel existed?" Adrian nodded slowly. "It was shut down before I joined the force, but if the killer has this map, they've been exploring places we can't access." His eyes darkened with realization. The killer is hiding somewhere between the 2 stations. As they left the office, Adrian noticed something he hadn't before. Passengers watching him too closely, eyes flicking away when he turned. Whispers trailing behind him. The fear was spreading. And fear was exactly what the killer thrived on. Adrian knew he had little time before the next message, the next trap, the next twisted clue pulling him deeper into the labyrinth of the past. As he returned to the investigation room, he understood that the next step wasn't about evidence or logic. It was about memory, about retracing the events from 12 years ago, about facing the truth he once failed to uncover. The killer wasn't just forcing him to chase them, they were forcing him to remember. Chapter 7. The night of the assertion reconstructed. The sky had already begun to darken by the time Adrian Cross settled into the old records room. a cramped and rarely visited corner beneath the station offices where dust and silence had formed a partnership long before he joined the force. A single yellow lamp flickered overhead, casting long, trembling shadows across stacks of faded reports and forgotten archives. Adrian exhaled slowly as he opened the file he had been avoiding for 12 years. The Everthorne case. Time had not softened the weight of its pages, if anything. The killer's actions had sharpened every memory, forcing each detail to claw its way back into the present. The missing maintenance worker, the boy in the ceremonial uniform, the fire that spread too fast to be an accident, and the unexplained disappearance that had haunted him long after the official report was closed. Every piece was still there, staring at him like unfinished sentences. He flipped through the photos until he paused at an image of the boy clearer than the faded one the killer had left. A solemn child with dark eyes and neatly combed hair wearing the same blue and red uniform. Name Rowan Miles, age 12. Missing. Presumed caught in the fire, but no body was ever recovered. Adrian rubbed his forehead. Rowan Miles had been the son of one of Everthorne's long-serving workers, Jonathan Miles, who had disappeared the day after the fire. At the time, investigators believed grief had driven him away. Adrian had always suspected something else, but he lacked the evidence. Now, as he examined the childish handwriting scrawled on the back of one old photograph, Trainmaster Rowan, he felt something shift, like two separate timelines beginning to knit together. The ceremonial uniform wasn't just symbolic, it signified a role. A tradition at Everthorne where select children helped during festivals, wearing uniforms from an old railway society. If Rowan was one of those children, then the missing uniform piece, the whistle, and the vintage ticket were not random. A knock interrupted his chain of thought. Kieran entered with urgency, in his step. "Sir, we traced the map." Adrian raised his eyebrows. "And?" Kieran set down a blueprint of the station tunnels. "That old circled route, it still exists. Not fully, but part of it is accessible through a sealed maintenance hatch near the old signal tower." Adrian's pulse quickened. "Show me." Kieran pointed to a red mark. "Here. But the hatch was welded shut years ago. According to records, no one has visited it since." Adrian frowned. "Yet the killer clearly has." As they left the records room, Adrian took the Everthorne file with him. The time for avoiding the past had ended. The path to the signal tower took them across quieter parts of the station where only the hum of old machinery and distant rumbling of passing trains filled the air. The tower itself was a relic, preserved for historical value but rarely used. Its walls bore peeling paint and its stairwell smelled of rust and damp stone. At the base, behind a stack of unused crates, they found the hatch. Welded edges, corroded metal, and yet something was off. Adrian crouched, running his fingers along the bottom edge. Then he saw it, a fresh scratch mark, thin but unmistakable. Someone had recently tampered with it. "Cut the welds," Adrian ordered. Within minutes, a team arrived with tools, sparks flying as metal surrendered under pressure. When the door finally creaked open, a cold draft swept out, carrying the scent of old earth, stagnant water, and something else. Something metallic and unsettlingly familiar. Adrian stepped into the narrow passage, flashlight in hand, the others close behind. The tunnel was old, its walls lined with outdated wiring and crumbling bricks. The deeper they went, the colder it grew, the echoes of their footsteps bouncing unnervingly. After several minutes, they reached a chamber sealed by an iron gate. Adrian's beam caught something on the floor beyond it, a lantern, similar to the one they had found earlier, and beside it another wooden box. Fear prickled along his spine, but he unlocked the gate and entered. The box was lighter than expected. Inside lay a stack of papers tied with string. Adrian untied it, revealing old letters written in neat handwriting. all addressed to the same person, Rowan Miles. The letters were signed by Jonathan Miles. Adrian read quickly, his heart tightening as the picture became clearer. Jonathan wrote of danger, of a conflict with railway officials, of secrets hidden beneath the station, and of his intention to protect his son at all costs. The last letter shook Adrian. "Rowan, if anything happens to me, follow the hidden path. The truth lies where the echoes begin. Trust no one but yourself." Kieran inhaled sharply. "Sir, these letters were never delivered." Adrian nodded grimly. "The killer wants us to find them. They want us to know Rowan wasn't just a boy who disappeared. He was a boy running from something." He placed the letters back in the box when something else caught his eye. A faint chalk mark on the far wall, identical to the killer's symbols. He approached it, running his hand across the rough surface. It wasn't new. It had been here for years, but recently traced over to freshen it. Beneath it, carved faintly into the stone, were initials. R.M. Adrian whispered the name. "Rowan Miles." Kieran stepped closer. This was his hiding place. Adrian stared into the darkness, or his prison. Before they could explore further, a soft clicking sound echoed from the tunnel behind them. Both men snapped their flashlights up. A silhouette stood briefly at the far end of the corridor, small, slender, unmoving. For a heartbeat, it felt like the past had returned in physical form. But then the figure turned and bolted. "Go!" Adrian shouted. They sprinted down the tunnel, beams of light cutting through the stale air. The figure was fast, too fast for a child, too quick for someone unfamiliar with the underground routes. They vanished around a bend, and by the time Adrian reached the exit ladder, the hatch above was wide open. By the time they climbed out, the figure had disappeared into the maze of service paths around the tower. Kieran bent over, catching his breath. "Sir, who was that? It looked like—" Adrian finished the sentence quietly. "A ghost from Everthorne." He held the letters tightly. The killer wasn't just taunting him now. They were appearing, revealing glimpses of themselves, drawing him deeper into the labyrinth. Adrian looked toward the distant silhouette of the abandoned Everthorne line disappearing into shadows. Something told him the answers waited there, buried beneath years of silence and soot. Rowan Miles' story was far from over, and so was the killer's. Chapter 8. The net tightens around a single story. The following morning dawned crisp and pearl gray, with a faint mist drifting across the green like a thin muslin scarf. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual, prompted not by her customary instinct for domestic routine, but by a sense that the mystery had reached a delicate tipping point. The village was no longer merely whispering about the doubtful assertion. It was now buzzing, in the discreet yet persistent manner unique to St. Mary Mead. People were smiling a little too politely, greeting one another with voices slightly too bright, watching each other with narrowed eyes over hedges and teacups. It was the kind of atmosphere, Miss Marple reflected, that often reveals far more than people intend to hide. She dressed in a soft lavender cardigan, pinned her silver brooch neatly in place, and made her way toward the high street. The sound of distant church bells drifted through the air, the vicar testing something or other for Sunday. And it struck Miss Marple that her first stop should indeed be the vicarage. There was something the vicar had let slip 2 days prior, something she hadn't fully examined at the time. And she had learned long ago that the smallest remark, the merest misremembered detail, could unravel an entire web of deceit. The vicarage door swung open before she even finished knocking. Mrs. Grayson, the vicar's wife, greeted her with the warm, slightly flustered expression she always wore when visitors arrived unexpectedly. "Miss Marple, dear, do come in. I've just set out a fresh lemon sponge." Miss Marple offered a grateful smile. How lovely. I wondered if the vicar might spare me just a moment. Mrs. Grayson ushered her inside, leading her past the narrow hallway with its polished umbrella stand and framed scripture into the cozy drawing room. The vicar was seated near the window, spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose. Reading a letter he quickly folded away upon seeing her. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, rising, "how may I be of service?" Miss Marple sat primly at the edge of a comfortable armchair, hands folded neatly. "I fear I must trouble you again regarding Mr. Denham's assertion," she began gently. "You may recall mentioning something about hearing the gate latch at precisely 7:30 on the evening in question?" The vicar frowned slightly, as though attempting to comb through the cluttered shelves of his memory. Yes, I believe I did. I was just preparing my notes for the choir arrangements." Miss Marple nodded. "And you are quite sure of the time?" He hesitated, a pause that was almost imperceptible, yet Miss Marple noted it like a flare in the dark. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose I cannot be entirely certain. My wristwatch has been rather unreliable of late. Sometimes it stops altogether unless it's tapped." Mrs. Grayson clucked in disapproval from the sideboard. "I've told you countless times, dear, to have it mended." The vicar gave a sheepish half-smile. "So you see, Miss Marple, I may have been off by a few minutes." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A few minutes? In a mystery, a few minutes could be everything. She thanked them both warmly, accepted a slice of lemon sponge to take with her, and stepped back into the cooling morning air. If the vicar's timing was unreliable, then one of the crucial alibis resting on it might crumble entirely. But it was her next visit, unexpected even to herself, that proved the most revealing. She made her way to Rose Cottage, where Miss Henrietta Blythe lived alone with her Persian cat Priscilla and an impressive number of lace doilies. Henrietta had been one of the quieter suspects, hovering at the edge of things, neither drawing suspicion nor deflecting it. But quiet people, Miss Marple knew, often noticed the most. Henrietta answered the door in her gardening apron, gloves tucked into her waistband. Her expression flickered. Surprise first, then something else that quickly retreated. "Miss Marple, how delightful. I wasn't expecting company." "No one ever is in matters of truth," Miss Marple said, stepping inside as Henrietta guided her to the sitting room. "I should like to trouble you for just a small detail. You mentioned when we last spoke seeing Mr. Denham pass your gate that evening?" Henrietta's smile was steady, but her eyes did not quite match its warmth. "Yes, indeed, just as I said. He walked by on his way home." "Carrying anything?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "A parcel, perhaps, or wearing his usual coat?" Henrietta blinked. "Why, I believe he had a coat, yes." She sounded unsure, fuzziness creeping into the edges of her memory. "And did you wave or speak? Or did he acknowledge you in any way?" Another pause, the faintest crack in the carefully tended facade. "Well, no. I was trimming the roses. I only glimpsed him, really." Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her expression soft but probing. "Curious. Because Mr. Denham insists he stopped to speak with you. Quite warmly, he said." The color drained a shade from Henrietta's cheeks. He said that?" Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. Yet the vicar heard the gate latch at a time which no longer seems certain, and Mrs. Pemberton claims Mr. Denham borrowed her umbrella that very evening, an umbrella she later found still damp with dew, not rain. Which raises the question, was anyone truly where they claimed to be that night?" Henrietta's hands tightened around each other, wringing the gardening gloves as though they were a confession waiting to burst forth. But she said nothing, only offered a thin smile and a murmured excuse about needing to check her scones in the oven, though Miss Marple doubted there were any scones at all. Miss Marple walked thoughtfully back toward the lane. She sensed it now more sharply than ever. Someone was lying. Someone who had woven a fragile story, counting on small details to hold it together. But those details were starting to fray. As she approached the square, she found herself intercepted by Colonel Faraday bustling toward her with his unmistakably purposeful stride. "Miss Marple, just the very person I wish to see. I've remembered something. Something about that infernal assertion Denham made." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "Yes, Colonel," he harumphed. "Dash it all, I didn't think much of it at the time, but the man told me he'd been home by 8, swore to it. Yet I distinctly recall seeing him near the telephone box at 8:10, looking agitated as a ferret in a hen house." Miss Marple felt the puzzle pieces clicking into place. Denham had been lying, or at the very least bending the truth to breaking point. And if his story did not hold, then everything hinged on discovering why he had made the claim in the first place. She thanked the colonel, who stomped away muttering darkly about people who couldn't keep their timelines straight, and continued down the lane with renewed clarity. The doubtful assertion had seemed small, almost trivial when she first overheard it in the tea room. But now she knew better. It was the loose thread which, when tugged, might unravel a much larger secret. By the time she reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple was certain of one thing. Someone in St. Mary Mead had built their entire alibi on a story that simply could not stand, and she intended to pull the entire structure down, gently, politely, but undeniably, in the next day's inquiries. For now, though, she stepped inside, put the kettle on, and allowed the comforting scent of Earl Grey to settle her thoughts. The truth was circling closer. So were the lies. And Miss Marple, with her needle-sharp intuition and deceptively gentle manner, was about to stitch everything into its rightful place. Chapter 9. The Dramatic Revelation. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead with a serene quiet, almost at odds with the tension that had gripped the village for days. Miss Marple, having spent the afternoon retracing timelines and carefully reviewing each alibi, felt that the threads of the mystery were finally converging. The doubtful assertion, the missing boy, the vanished maintenance worker, and the curious sequence of cryptic symbols, all were about to collide in a revelation that would shock the village, yet leave its gentle atmosphere intact. She had invited the key suspects to her drawing room under the pretense of a small tea gathering, and one by one they arrived. Mr. Denham still confident in his carefully constructed story, Mrs. Pemberton anxious yet primly composed, Colonel Faraday with his brisk military precision, and Miss Henrietta Blythe, whose quiet demeanor had so far concealed far more than anyone suspected. Even Kieran and Officer Mira, invited as observers, found themselves silently bracing for the confrontation Miss Marple had promised would occur before tea was served. Once everyone was assembled, Miss Marple poured the tea with her characteristic delicacy, allowing the ritual to soften the room, to lower defenses, and to establish the gentle rhythm in which truth would reveal itself. "It is curious," she began, her voice light but precise, "how small details can sometimes mislead us and yet, if observed carefully, can illuminate everything." She paused, allowing the sentence to sink in as eyes shifted nervously among the assembled guests. "I think it is time we review the evening in question and the sequence of events that has so puzzled everyone." The flicker of candlelight reflected in her keen eyes, which, despite their softness, carried a penetrating clarity that no one could ignore. "Mr. Denham, perhaps you would recount your movements that evening for us once more." Denham straightened, adjusting his tie with a touch too much confidence. "Of course, Miss Marple. I returned home at 8 o'clock sharp, as I always do. Nothing unusual occurred, and I retired promptly." Miss Marple nodded, serene. "Yet Colonel Faraday observed you near the telephone box at 8:10. That is, an hour after your supposed return." How do you account for this discrepancy? Denham's face tightened ever so slightly, the first crack in his mask. I must have forgotten to mention a brief walk, he stammered. Just a moment's reflection, you see. His eyes flickered toward Henrietta, though she remained outwardly composed. Miss Marple made no immediate comment, allowing the weight of the contradiction to settle. She then guided the conversation gently toward the other elements of the mystery. The whistle found at the station, the ticket, the map, and of course the letters from Jonathan Miles. They all point toward a single path long obscured that leads back to the Everthorne incident. A murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Pemberton shifted, her hands tightening in her lap. "Miss Marple, you cannot truly believe," she began, only to be interrupted softly. "I do believe," Miss Marple said, her tone calm but unyielding, "that someone has been orchestrating a careful reenactment of the past, directing our attention, planting clues, and most importantly, guiding us to the final truth. That truth, I am certain, involves Rowan Miles, who, contrary to all assumptions, did survive the fire." Denham's color drained, Colonel Faraday's eyes narrowed, and Henrietta's fingers twitched against the edge of her teacup. Miss Marple stood, moving slowly around the room, each step deliberate, her presence commanding yet soothing. Rowan Miles's survival required secrecy. His father, Jonathan, sought to protect him from those who might exploit his knowledge of the Everthorne tunnels. But secrets, as we all know, have a way of resurfacing, especially when carefully orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of the events. She paused at the window, gazing momentarily at the misty street beyond, before returning her attention to the group. "Mr. Denham, you attempted to mislead us, perhaps not realizing how closely these details would be examined. You created alibis dependent on the clocks, the vicar, and Mrs. Pemberton's observations. Yet small inconsistencies betrayed your story. Your presence near the telephone box, the timing of your walk, and your insistence on certain events all indicate your involvement in guiding this mystery for reasons you hoped would remain hidden." Denham's eyes widened, and he opened his mouth to speak, only for Miss Marple to raise a hand gently. "Do not interrupt, please. The final piece of the puzzle is the person who has been placing the clues, the whistle, the letters, the box, and the carefully drawn maps. Someone who has intimate knowledge of Everthorne and the surrounding tunnels. Someone who has orchestrated each encounter, each cryptic message, and each carefully timed taunt. That person," she said, her eyes fixing on Henrietta, "is none other than you, Miss Blythe." The room fell silent. Henrietta's hands fell to her lap, trembling. Her carefully maintained calm now shattered, replaced by the weight of exposure. Miss Marple continued gently, "You were present in the shadows, ensuring that Adrian Cross and the others would follow the breadcrumbs, each clue leading inexorably to this moment. Why? Because Rowan Miles is your nephew. His disappearance and the fire's aftermath created a void that you could not ignore. You believed, in your way, that these events should be brought to light, but carefully, without causing undue alarm or harm to the community. Each symbol, each timing, each planted object, all of it was meant to recreate the journey of discovery that would lead to Rowan's story being told." Henrietta's lips trembled. I only wanted to ensure he was safe. I never intended to frighten anyone." Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening. "And yet fear often accompanies even the most carefully planned revelations. Your intentions were noble, but the method required deception, and deception always carries consequences." Adrian Cross, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, relief and wonder mingling in his features. "So Rowan survived all this time, and the messages, the tunnels, the recreated steps, it was all to bring us here?" Henrietta nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes, I had to ensure the path was clear, that the truth would emerge at the right moment, guided by someone capable of understanding the past's subtleties. Rowan. He is waiting, safe, for the right moment to come forward himself. Miss Marple poured the last of the tea and placed the pot on the tray. "And now," she said softly, "we know. The mystery is no longer doubtful, nor is it a mere assertion. The past has spoken and the present has listened." The group sat in a quiet moment, the weight of revelation settling over them like the soft warmth of a hearth on a chilly evening. Even Denham, chastened, nodded in acknowledgement. The drama had played out in words, in careful observation, and in patient reasoning, without violence or bitterness. Each participant, despite their role in confusion or misdirection, had witnessed the resolution of a mystery that spanned more than a decade. Outside, the village continued its quiet, unaware yet peaceful, as though St. Mary Mead itself held its breath, waiting for the sun to rise on another gentle day. Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate and composed. "Tea, my dears, is always a comforting conclusion," she said. The group rose as well, offering thanks to one another, and for a moment the village's gentle atmosphere was restored. The drama of the past had been unraveled, the truth revealed, and the community, though shaken by curiosity and suspense, was left with a sense of closure. As the last cup was poured, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. The doubtful assertion had led them all on a journey of discovery, and the threads, once tangled, had now been carefully woven into a tapestry of understanding. And as the evening shadows lengthened across the village square, she knew that in St. Mary Mead, justice, clarity, and gentle resolution had, once again, prevailed. Chapter 10. Resolution and Morning Tea. The morning sunlight poured gently through the lace-curtained windows of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting warm patterns across the polished oak table where a delicate tea service had been set. Outside, St. Mary Mead was already waking to its usual rhythm. The clip-clop of horses on cobbled streets, the distant laughter of children playing, and the low murmur of villagers exchanging morning greetings. It was a world that seemed untouched by the dark secrets and carefully concealed truths of the past days. Yet within Miss Marple's modest home, the air held a quiet triumph. The story of Rowan Miles, of the tunnels and the letters, of the missing whistle and carefully placed clues, had reached its natural conclusion. Those involved in the mystery were gathered around the table, sharing tea, small cakes, and a sense of relief that words alone could convey. Adrian Cross, Colonel Faraday, Kieran, Mrs. Pemberton, Mr. Denham, and even Henrietta Blythe, whose role as orchestrator of the clues had been revealed the evening prior, were all present. Miss Marple herself moved with graceful efficiency, pouring tea and placing the tiny milk jug just so, all the while letting the warmth of her presence calm any lingering tension. "Miss Marple," Adrian began, breaking the delicate silence, "I cannot thank you enough. Without your insight, the mystery would have continued indefinitely, and Rowan's story might have remained hidden forever." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly, her eyes twinkling behind round spectacles. "It is often the small details," she said, "the ordinary observations that others overlook, which illuminate extraordinary truths. One need only have patience, and a willingness to notice what the rest of the world dismisses." She gestured toward the letters from Jonathan Miles, now neatly bound with string, their contents read aloud by Kieran the previous evening. "These letters," she continued, "were not merely instructions or cryptic messages. They were a lifeline, a carefully constructed path meant to guide those with understanding to the truth. The past and present have danced together to reveal what had long been concealed." Her voice carried the gentle authority of someone who had lived long enough to know that truth, when approached patiently and thoughtfully, always finds its way to the surface. Henrietta Blythe, seated across the table with hands clasped, gave a soft, almost apologetic smile. "I only wanted to protect Rowan," she admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "The fire, the disappearance, it was all too much for a child to endure alone. I could not reveal him, not until I was certain it was safe. The clues, the letters, the map, I placed them so that you, Miss Marple, and the others might lead us to him without raising alarm or danger." Miss Marple nodded, appreciating both the courage and the care behind Henrietta's actions. "You were wise, but careful wisdom must always be balanced with transparency. And now, thanks to patience and keen observation, we know that Rowan is safe, that the mystery has resolved itself, and that the village can continue in peace." A soft murmur of agreement passed around the room, even from Mr. Denham, whose previous attempts to conceal or manipulate the narrative now seemed muted in the presence of truth and measured reflection. Colonel Faraday cleared his throat, leaning back with a faint smile. "I must admit, Miss Marple, your method is extraordinary. In my line of work, one often expects confrontation, evidence, and declarations. Yet here, resolution comes through observation, intuition, and the careful orchestration of gentle reasoning. I am impressed." Miss Marple allowed herself a tiny smile, modest yet knowing. "It is often the quiet work," she replied, "the attention to seemingly insignificant details, the way a gate latch clicks, the manner in which a letter is folded, the position of a teacup, that holds the key to understanding human behavior and, in turn, the unfolding of events." Kieran, seated next to Adrian, nodded enthusiastically. "I've never seen anything like it. The patterns, the symbols, the subtle hints. It was like following a trail of breadcrumbs in a forest, except the forest was made of ordinary village life." The group laughed softly, the tension of the previous days giving way to the warm satisfaction that comes with closure. Mrs. Pemberton, always concerned with propriety, delicately stirred her tea before speaking. "It is a relief to know that despite all the confusion, our community remains intact. St. Mary Mead will endure with all its familiar faces without the shadow of fear or resentment." Miss Marple inclined her head in agreement. "Yes, the village's strength lies in its ordinary rhythms, in the care neighbors take with one another, and in the small acts of kindness that are easily overlooked. Even when mystery and uncertainty arise, it is these everyday virtues that provide stability and reassurance." She paused to hand a small plate of freshly baked scones to Henrietta. "And it is these small acts, like sharing tea, that remind us that life continues, even after the storm of events has passed." Adrian, finally relaxing into a chair and sipping his tea, spoke quietly, reflecting on the long investigation. "It is remarkable how something so complex, a series of cryptic messages, missing individuals, and elaborate alibis, can be unraveled through patience, observation, and a clear mind. The village owes you a debt, Miss Marple." She shook her head gently, refusing accolades. "The debt is mutual. One learns much about people, human nature, and the resilience of ordinary communities when listening carefully, watching patiently, and asking the right questions." Her gaze swept over the gathered group, softening with warmth and satisfaction. "And now Rowan's story will be told at the proper time, and the past will be honored without overshadowing the present." The conversation drifted to lighter topics: the springtime planting, the church's upcoming festival, and plans for an afternoon stroll along the village green. Miss Marple quietly observed the group, her heart at ease. The tension that had gripped St. Mary Mead had dissolved into conversation, laughter, and the simple joy of shared tea. Even the subtle threads of intrigue once so tightly wound around the missing boy and the doubtful assertion had been laid bare. understood, and gently resolved. Outside, birds chirped softly among the budding branches, and the sun continued its warm ascent. Inside, the room glowed with calm reassurance, a testament to the triumph of thoughtful reasoning, gentle courage, and the quiet authority of an observant mind. As the last teacup was drained, Miss Marple rose and placed the pot on its tray. "It has been a morning well spent," she said, her tone light and gracious, yet filled with quiet authority. "The mystery has been resolved, the truths revealed, and the village restored to its peaceful rhythm. Let us remember always that even the smallest details matter, and that patience and observation can illuminate even the most complex of puzzles." The guests nodded, rising to leave, each carrying a sense of relief, closure, and respect for the wisdom and gentle guidance of the elderly detective who had quietly orchestrated the unveiling of the truth. Miss Marple remained at the table for a moment, gazing out the window at the green expanse beyond. The village, bathed in morning light, seemed serene once more, yet she knew that life in St. Mary Mead would continue with its blend of ordinary concerns, gentle surprises, and occasional mysteries, each solvable by those with a sharp eye, a patient mind, and a compassionate heart. And with that comforting thought, she poured herself a final cup of tea, savoring the warmth and tranquility of a morning in which justice, clarity, and understanding had quietly prevailed.